Warning disclaimer. This story is a fictionalized account inspired by Robbie Williams' real-life interest in the paranormal, which he has publicly discussed. However, all characters, incidents, and supernatural events in this story are entirely imaginary and created for dramatic and entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, locations, or events is purely coincidental. This tale is not meant to misrepresent or make factual claims about Robbie Williams or his personal experiences. Listener discretion is advised. Robbie Williams sat across from the microphone in a dimly lit podcast studio, the overhead lights casting a warm, theatrical glow on his face. The host leaned forward, eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Robbie," he said, "you've hinted before about your interest in ghosts and the paranormal, but you've never told a real story. Are you ready now?" Robbie gave a nervous laugh and scratched the back of his neck. "You know," he began, "people think I'm joking when I talk about ghosts. But honestly, there are things I've experienced that I can't explain, things that chilled me to the bone." His voice, usually confident and playful, now carried a strange weight. "I never spoke about it in detail, but tonight, I think I will." He leaned closer to the mic, lowering his voice. "It started when I was a child. My grandmother used to tell me ghost stories, true ones, according to her. I thought she was just trying to scare me. But strange things would happen. Toys moving on their own. Footsteps when no one was home. My parents blamed it on my imagination, but I knew what I saw." The host nodded silently, clearly enthralled. Robbie continued, "Even back then, I had this sixth sense. I get these feelings when entering certain places, like I was being watched. That cold tension that crawls down your spine. It followed me even into adulthood." He took a deep breath. "I thought I'd left it behind. You know, with all the fame, the concerts, the fans, life gets noisy. But that darkness, it found its way back into my life when I bought a house in Wiltshire." Robbie's eyes darkened slightly, and he seemed to drift off for a moment, as if reliving the memory. It was this massive, gorgeous place. Old, grand. It had charm, history, and, as I later found out, a reputation. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Locals told me weird stories. Ghosts of children. A lady in white. A curse. I laughed it off at first, like most people would. But I should have listened. Because what happened next, it wasn't a story. It was real, and it nearly broke me." The studio fell into a thick silence. Robbie's expression was dead serious now. "There were nights I couldn't sleep. I'd hear doors creaking open, even though I locked everything. I'd hear breathing in my room, slow, heavy breathing, while I was wide awake. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but when I started seeing things, shadows that didn't belong to anything, a face in the window when no one was outside, I knew something was wrong." The host finally broke the silence. "Did anyone else experience it? Or was it just you?" "My wife did. My staff. Even guests," Robbie replied. "One friend of mine ran out in the middle of the night and refused to ever return. He said something touched his face while he was sleeping." Robbie leaned back, his face haunted. "You know, it's easy to dismiss things like this when you hear them secondhand. But when you're living it, when your home stops feeling safe and you start doubting your sanity, it changes you." He glanced at the audio technician behind the glass and lowered his voice. "This is just the beginning. The worst part, the real story, didn't begin until I started recording music in that house. That's when things escalated beyond anything I could have imagined." The host looked both excited and unnerved. "Are you ready to share it?" Robbie nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think it's time people heard what really happened in that house." The mansion in Wiltshire was a dream on paper, a sprawling estate nestled in the countryside, surrounded by rolling green hills and centuries-old trees. When Robbie Williams first laid eyes on the property, it felt like the perfect escape from the chaos of the spotlight. The old stone facade, the wrought iron gates, the ivy crawling up the walls. It had a kind of mystical charm, something ancient yet regal. "It felt like a place where time stood still," Robbie would later say. "But I didn't realize that some things in that house had never moved on." The house had been built in the 1700s and had passed through many hands. Some of its owners left abruptly. Some were never heard from again. The estate agent had glossed over its history, focusing more on its antique fireplaces and vaulted ceilings. But the villagers nearby, when they found out who was moving in, had whispered warnings. Old legends. Stories of children who vanished in the orchard. A woman who wandered the halls in white, her face always turned away. A door in the east wing that no one dared open. Robbie, at first, dismissed these tales as local superstition. "You know how it is," he said. "Big old house, small town, spooky rumors." I thought it added to the atmosphere. But things changed quickly once he and his family moved in. The first few weeks were calm. The house creaked, as all old houses do. The wind howled through the chimneys. Doors sometimes closed on their own. But nothing out of the ordinary, until Robbie's daughter started waking up crying every night, saying the lady wouldn't let her sleep. She kept pointing to the corner of her room, Robbie recalled. Said the lady in white would stand there, whispering to her in a voice she couldn't understand. At first, I thought it was just a child's imagination. But then my wife started hearing footsteps upstairs when no one was there. It escalated quickly. Doors would slam violently in the middle of the night. Lights flickered even after electricians checked the wiring. Cold spots would appear in rooms that had no reason to be cold. Robbie described one night when he walked into his home office and found all the books on the shelves stacked neatly in a pyramid on the floor. No one had been home all day. The staff, too, began reporting incidents. One maid quit abruptly after claiming she saw a child standing at the end of the hallway, only to vanish when approached. The groundskeeper found fresh footprints in the mud leading to the orchard, small, bare footprints, even though no one had been outside. It was during a dinner party that things took a terrifying turn. Robbie had invited a few close friends over. The night had been filled with music, laughter, and wine, until the chandelier in the dining room began to sway. Then, without warning, it crashed to the floor in the middle of the meal, shattering glass everywhere. No one was hurt, but the guests were shaken. One friend claimed she felt an icy hand grip her shoulder just seconds before it happened. "We laughed it off in front of everyone," Robbie said. "But deep down I knew this wasn't normal. This wasn't a coincidence." Out of growing concern for his family, Robbie began researching the house's history in more detail. What he found was unsettling. In 1841, the mansion had been home to a wealthy baron whose children died one by one, struck by illness, supposedly. The governess who looked after them vanished shortly afterward. Her body was never found. Locals believed she had either gone mad or been blamed for the deaths and killed in secret. But many insisted her spirit still lingered, especially near the nursery wing, the same place where Robbie's daughter kept seeing the woman. Robbie tried to ignore it, hoping the activity would fade with time. But it only got worse. The house felt heavy, like it held its breath. Mirrors would fog without reason. Paintings seemed to shift positions slightly, as though someone had been touching them. The atmosphere was suffocating. Even the dogs wouldn't go into certain rooms, Robbie remembered. They'd just growl low and constant, staring into nothing. Despite his reluctance to believe fully in the supernatural, Robbie knew something was happening that couldn't be explained by faulty wiring or paranoia. This wasn't just an old house creaking. This was a house that wanted to be heard, and it would only grow louder. The decision to build a home studio within the Wiltshire estate seemed perfect at the time. With miles between him and the paparazzi, Robbie Williams could finally write and record music in peace. The space he chose was once an old library, tucked away in the eastern wing, the oldest part of the house. He had it renovated and soundproofed, transforming it into a modern creative sanctuary, complete with state-of-the-art equipment. But what began as an exciting artistic venture would soon spiral into one of the most disturbing experiences of his life. The room always felt a bit strange, Robbie recalled. Colder than the rest of the house, like the air was thinner in there. At first, he chalked it up to bad insulation. But something about the energy inside the studio never settled. The first strange incident happened during a late-night recording session. Robbie was laying down vocals for a new track, just him, his sound engineer Dave, and a quiet atmosphere. They finished a rough take and played it back. But when they listened, they both froze. Overlaying the background of the chorus was a faint, chilling sound, a woman's voice. Soft, mournful, almost like humming. but no female vocals had been recorded. The track was raw, untouched. It wasn't just ambience, said Dave. It was deliberate, melodic, like someone trying to harmonize with him. They scrubbed the track again and again. It was undeniably there. Thinking it might be a technical glitch, they restarted the system, checked all the inputs, but everything was normal. They even re-recorded the vocals the next day in a different room. Yet again, the same voice appeared in the mix, now louder, clearer. She was singing with me, Robbie said, his voice tight. That's when I stopped believing it was just the house making noise. As the studio sessions continued, so did the disturbances. Instruments would go out of tune on their own. Computers crashed mid-recording. Unedited files rearranged themselves, with tracks missing or altered in ways no one could explain. Sometimes the mics would pick up whispering when no one was near them, inaudible words, but unmistakably human. Then came the temperature drops. The studio would plunge into freezing cold without warning, often while they were in the middle of a session. One night, breath was visible in the air, even though it was a warm spring evening outside. Dave brought in a thermometer. It read 4 degrees Celsius. The rest of the house remained normal. The worst part, Robbie said, was the feeling that someone was standing right behind me. All the time, even when I was alone. More than once, he felt his chair shift slightly, as if someone was leaning on it. He'd turn around, nothing. Robbie started to notice patterns. The strange occurrences always happened when he sang certain lyrics, lines that mentioned love, death, or sorrow. It was as if the entity resonated with emotion, drawn to vulnerability. One night, while reviewing takes in the studio alone, Robbie heard the piano play a single note by itself. He froze. The keyboard was unplugged. Before he could react, a soft voice whispered in his right ear, "Sing it again." He bolted from the room and didn't enter it for days. By now, even skeptics among his team began to accept something unexplainable was happening. A second engineer left without notice after claiming to see a woman standing behind Robbie during a session. He said she looked directly at him through the studio glass and smiled. A paranormal investigator was quietly consulted. He brought emotion detectors, EMF readers, and EVP recorders. The results were chilling. Static-laced recordings revealed faint phrases like, "Let me in," and "This is my song." The investigator confirmed the energy in the studio was extremely active, especially in the corner near the old bookshelf, part of the original structure of the house. That area would later lead to an even darker discovery. Robbie eventually stopped recording there. I couldn't focus. I couldn't create. It felt like every note I sang was feeding something, he explained. And whatever it was, it didn't want me to stop. What had once been a place of creativity had turned into a chamber of dread. And while the music was hauntingly beautiful, the presence behind it was anything but. As the studio fell silent and Robbie Williams avoided the eastern wing altogether, the strange occurrences didn't stop. They simply shifted. Instead of equipment malfunctioning or ghostly harmonies creeping into his tracks, the haunting took a much more personal turn. It began with the dreams, vivid, terrifying, and deeply unsettling. Night after night, Robbie found himself waking in a cold sweat, his breath ragged, heart pounding in his chest. He would dream of a long hallway, dimly lit, lined with portraits whose eyes followed him. At the end of this hallway stood a tall figure, an old woman dressed in a high-necked Victorian gown. She never moved. She simply stared. Her eyes were completely black. And every time Robbie turned to run, he would awaken, his room freezing cold, and the feeling of someone standing right next to his bed lingering long after his eyes opened. At first, he told himself it was stress, a combination of too many late nights and the anxiety of the house's growing energy. But then his wife started having the same dreams. She too described the hallway, the woman, the same sensation of paralysis. And she hadn't told Robbie until she was sure he was experiencing it too. One night, things escalated beyond dreams. Robbie had fallen asleep around midnight. He awoke a few hours later, drenched in sweat. The air in the bedroom was freezing. The windows were shut, the heater was off, and still, he could see his own breath in the dark. As he sat up, trying to calm himself, he felt a sharp sting on his forearm. He turned on the light, and there were 3 distinct scratch marks running from his elbow to his wrist. Not deep enough to bleed heavily, but enough to hurt. "I know how it sounds," he said, "but I swear I didn't do it to myself. And my nails weren't long enough to make marks like that." That morning, he tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he'd scratched himself during sleep. Maybe his watch or bracelet had caused it. But the direction and precision of the scratches didn't match any object he owned. And worse, the following night, they appeared again, this time on his back. Robbie's mental state began to deteriorate. He became jumpy, irritable, exhausted. Sleep was nearly impossible. He started spending hours researching sleep paralysis, demonic hauntings, and psychic attacks. But the deeper he went, the more questions he found, and none of them brought him peace. One morning, after a particularly brutal night of zero sleep, Robbie woke to find all the mirrors in the house, every single one, covered in condensation. Not foggy, not steamed up, just enough moisture to clearly see 5 words written across the glass in uneven handwriting. "She is still watching you." Every mirror, every room. His wife had packed an overnight bag without a word. "We're going to my sister's," she said quietly. "I won't stay here another night." Robbie didn't blame her. That same evening, left alone in the mansion, Robbie wandered the halls, determined to confront whatever had taken over his life. He ended up in the corridor near the studio. He hadn't been there in weeks. It was quiet, too quiet. The silence felt unnatural, dense, like the house was holding its breath. Then he heard it, the lullaby, a soft, distant melody like a mother singing to a child. It echoed faintly through the air vents, familiar but ancient. Robbie followed it, slowly, cautiously, his feet moving as if against his own will. The song seemed to pull him. It led him back into the studio. Cold air poured from under the door. He hesitated, hand trembling on the doorknob. When he opened it, the room was pitch black, even though he'd left the lights on. And in the center of the room stood the old woman. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared with those endless black eyes. Robbie couldn't move, couldn't scream. He could feel the chill crawling up his spine, paralyzing him. And then she whispered, not with her mouth, but in his head, "You opened the door. Now you must finish what you started." The lights snapped on. The woman vanished. But Robbie was never the same again. After weeks of escalating terror, unexplainable voices, scratches in the night, freezing rooms, and that final haunting encounter in the studio, Robbie Williams had reached his breaking point. Alone in a house that no longer felt like his own, he realized this was no longer a matter of superstition. It was real. It was dangerous. And it wasn't going away on its own. That's when he made the call. Through a trusted friend in Los Angeles who had experience with spiritual cleansings, Robbie was connected to a discreet team of paranormal investigators. They weren't just ghost hunting YouTubers with gadgets and cameras. This group consisted of professionals, psychic mediums, energy readers, and a parapsychologist who had consulted on real government-funded research. They agreed to visit the Wiltshire estate quietly, with no press or public involvement. They arrived on a gray Thursday morning, their unmarked black van pulling into the long gravel driveway. Robbie greeted them himself. "It's worse at night," he warned, "and especially in the eastern wing." The team began their assessment immediately. They set up motion sensors in the halls, thermal imaging cameras in the studio, EMF meters in the bedrooms, and digital voice recorders in the coldest rooms. One of the psychics, a quiet woman named Elise, simply stood in the foyer, eyes closed, hand on the banister. After several minutes, she whispered, "She's here. She's angry." That night, the group gathered in the studio for the main investigation. Robbie, anxious but determined, agreed to stay and witness what they found. The air was colder than usual. Everyone felt it. Elise sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by candles, and entered a meditative trance. The rest of the team remained silent, monitoring their devices. Robbie sat near the wall, watching. Within minutes, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, enough that their breaths became visible. The EMF meters began to flicker wildly. One of the recorders picked up rhythmic knocking, 3 slow taps, followed by silence, then 3 again. Elise's breathing changed. She whispered something Robbie could barely hear. She never left. She never forgave. And she wanted him to sing. Suddenly, one of the motion detectors triggered in the hallway, though no one was there. The door slammed shut by itself. The candles flickered violently, and a high-pitched tone filled the room, a sound so sharp and unnatural that everyone covered their ears. Then the piano, unplugged and untouched, played a single key. Twice. Elise collapsed. The team rushed to her, shaken. She was pale and trembling, eyes wide open but unfocused. "She showed me everything," she said hoarsely. "The children, the fire, the song." Robbie knelt beside her. "What do you mean, the fire?" "She burned herself," Elise whispered. "They blamed her for the deaths. They locked her in that room. She sang to the children even as they died. And now she thinks you're one of them. A performer. An artist. She wants you to sing the song again. She believes she can finish what was started. Through you." That night, the investigators left their equipment running and retreated to a nearby inn. Elise, too shaken to return, left with them. Only the parapsychologist, Dr. Jensen, stayed behind with Robbie to review the audio recordings. What they heard was beyond explanation. On one of the EVPs from the nursery wing, a voice, clear, slow, unmistakable, whispered, "I waited. I watched. I sang for him." Another clip recorded in the studio featured the chilling sound of children laughing, guttural, unnatural, and a low voice beneath it, "Bring him to me." The next morning, the team returned to collect their devices, but several pieces had been damaged. Melted wires, drained batteries, and corrupted memory cards. Dr. Jensen was visibly disturbed. "I've worked on over 200 cases," he told Robbie. "This is different. The energy here isn't residual. It's intelligent, intentional, and focused on you." He strongly advised Robbie to leave the house and never return. "It isn't just haunted," Jensen said. "It's inhabited." Robbie followed that advice. He moved his family out within the week, leaving behind personal items, instruments, even unreleased music files. The house was too dangerous. But even after leaving, Robbie couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed him. Shadows at the edge of his vision. Soft music playing when nothing was turned on. And most disturbingly, waking up to the sound of humming in a voice that was not his own. After moving out of the mansion, Robbie couldn't shake the sense that the house held more secrets than anyone had realized. Determined to understand the full scope of what he'd encountered, he returned one last time, alone, to the Wiltshire estate, intent on exploring parts of the house he'd never dared to enter. His curiosity led him back to the eastern wing, the oldest section where the studio was housed. It was here that Robbie noticed something peculiar, a faint outline on the wall behind an ancient bookshelf. Unlike the rest of the ornate woodwork, this section seemed out of place, almost like a hidden door. Robbie ran his hand along the edges and felt a slight give. Heart pounding, he pulled on the bookshelf, which slowly creaked open, revealing a narrow passageway cloaked in dust and shadows. The air inside smelled of mold and old wood, a forgotten tomb in the middle of the house. Summoning every ounce of courage, Robbie stepped inside. The passage led to a small, cramped room, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper and strewn with broken furniture. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet. But what caught his attention most was a dusty, leather-bound diary resting on a decayed table. He wiped off the grime and opened the book to the first page, dated 1834. The handwriting was elegant but hurried. It was the diary of a governess named Eleanor Blackwood, who had cared for the Baron's children decades ago. As Robbie read, a chilling story unfolded. Eleanor described her love for the children, their bright smiles and laughter filling the halls. But the diary quickly darkened. The children grew ill, one by one, despite Eleanor's desperate attempts to care for them. Neighbors whispered about curses and evil spirits. The Baron's paranoia grew. Eleanor's entries became fragmented, filled with fear. On one final, desperate page, she wrote about a locked room in the East Wing, the nursery, and the shadows she saw moving behind the walls. She pleaded for help, begging God to save the children from the darkness that sings. Robbie's breath caught. This was the woman, the spirit that haunted the house. The governess who vanished without a trace. The diary's last entry was smudged with what looked like tears or blood. As he closed the diary, a sudden chill filled the room. The shadows seemed to deepen, swirling in the corners. Robbie heard faint whispering, like the soft hum of a lullaby sung long ago. He realized this hidden room was the heart of the haunting, the source of the restless spirit's pain and anger. The dolls scattered on the floor, broken toys, and children's shoes were relics of that tragic past, left behind like ghosts themselves. Robbie felt a mix of sorrow and dread. The spirit wasn't malevolent without cause. She was trapped in a cycle of grief and vengeance, tied to the house and to the fate of the children she once cared for. Determined to help, Robbie took the diary with him, hoping it might hold clues to breaking the haunting. But as he stepped back into the hallway, a cold hand seemed to brush his shoulder. He spun around, empty space. The house seemed to sigh, as if acknowledging his presence and his promise. The night Robbie Williams returned to the Wiltshire mansion for the final time, the air felt different, heavier, more watchful. He carried the governess's diary in a leather satchel and clutched a small box of old toys he had retrieved from the hidden room behind the bookshelf. This wasn't just closure. This was a confrontation. Not out of fear, but out of respect. He needed to face her. Alone, he made his way to the eastern wing, heart thudding in his chest. Every creak of the wooden floorboards echoed like a warning. The hallway lights flickered, but he kept walking until he stood at the door of the studio, now a place of silence and dread. Robbie opened the door slowly. The air inside was colder than ever. It was as if the room had been holding its breath, waiting for his return. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The silence wrapped around him like a noose. He placed the diary and the box of toys on the studio floor and sat cross-legged beside them. "I don't know your full story," he said aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know you were hurt. I know they blamed you. And I know you didn't deserve what happened." The moment he spoke, the lights dimmed and the temperature dropped further. The EMF reader on his phone began to spike, even though it wasn't connected to any external equipment. The atmosphere thickened, and a low, humming vibration filled the air. Then he heard it, the lullaby. Slow, echoing, the same eerie melody from his dreams. He looked up, and she was there. The governess. Eleanor Blackwood stood at the far end of the room, just outside the reach of the overhead light. Her figure was shrouded in shadow, her face still half hidden beneath long strands of hair. She didn't move, but her presence was overwhelming, heavy and sorrowful, as if her grief had solidified into a ghostly form. Robbie swallowed hard and stood. "I brought these," he said gently, pointing to the toys. "They belonged to the children, didn't they?" She didn't answer. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, and opened the diary. "I read your words. I know what they did to you. You try to protect them. And now you're stuck here, reliving the pain, over and over again." The temperature shifted. A tear ran down Robbie's cheek, though he didn't feel it happen. "You don't have to stay," he said. "You don't have to haunt this place. I'm not them. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I want to give you peace." The lights flickered violently, and Eleanor suddenly appeared just feet away, so close Robbie could see her face clearly for the first time. She was pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth frozen in an expression of eternal sadness. But there was no hatred, just heartbreak. Robbie didn't run. "I'll sing for you," he whispered. One last time, he closed his eyes and began to hum the lullaby, the same melody he had heard in his dreams, now etched into his soul. The room trembled. Furniture rattled. The piano played softly on its own, echoing his voice. It was as if the house was joining in mourning with him. When he opened his eyes again, she was crying. The governess stepped forward slowly, her expression changing. The dark aura around her began to fade. Her form flickered in the dim light. Less shadow, more substance. She reached out, not to harm him, but to touch the diary. Her fingers passed through it. Then, for the first time, she smiled. A warm light began to glow around her, soft and golden. The sorrow in the air lifted, replaced by a strange peace. Eleanor slowly turned, walked toward the far wall, and vanished. No scream. No one. Just silence. Real, beautiful silence. Robbie stood motionless for a long time. Something in the room had shifted. The chill was gone. The weight had lifted. He could breathe again. He didn't need a ghost hunter to tell him what had just happened. He felt it. She was gone. Not banished. Freed. And with her departure, the mansion, haunted for centuries, finally felt like just a house. The story never made the tabloids. There are no headlines, no leaked footage, no sensationalized articles. Robbie Williams, one of the most recognizable entertainers of his generation, had just faced something otherworldly and chose to carry the weight of it quietly. In the months following his final encounter in the Wiltshire mansion, Robbie sold the estate. The official reason given was that the countryside was too isolated, and he preferred something closer to the city. Only a few people knew the truth. The investigators who'd witnessed the phenomena, his wife, and a couple of trusted friends who were present when he broke down trying to explain what he'd seen. Even then, they weren't sure if they believed him, but they knew something had changed in him. Robbie became more private. He took fewer interviews. The albums he released afterward carried a noticeable shift in tone. Haunting melodies, melancholic lyrics, layered with themes of isolation, release, and unseen forces. Fans speculated that he was going through a spiritual or emotional awakening. The reality was far more literal. He stopped writing music at night. He avoided old houses. And most tellingly, he refused to discuss anything related to the supernatural in public, no matter how many hosts or interviewers asked. One time, during a late-night U.S. radio segment, a host tried to bring it up. "So, Robbie, is it true you used to live in a haunted house?" The studio chuckled. Robbie went still. For a full 10 seconds, he didn't speak. Then he said quietly, "Some stories don't belong on camera," and moved on. Privately, though, Robbie couldn't escape the subtle reminders. Sometimes, while listening to music at home, he'd hear a faint hum beneath the instruments, a woman's voice, barely there, matching the lullaby. Engineers would insist there was no vocal track. He stopped listening to that track altogether. There were other moments, too. Dreams, now infrequent but powerful, of the old hallway and Eleanor standing peacefully at the end, nodding once before fading. One night, his daughter told him she saw a kind lady in old clothes, watching her while she slept, smiling. Robbie asked her what the woman said. "She said thank you," the child replied. Though the haunting had ended, its impression remained imprinted in his life. When asked, off the record, why he didn't speak about it more openly, Robbie had a simple answer. Because people don't want the truth. They want entertainment. They want jump scares and fake psychics and ghost hunting shows where everyone screams. What happened to me, it wasn't exciting. It was tragic. It was sad. And it left something in me that I'll carry forever. He paused, then added, "Also, when you talk about ghosts, people either laugh or they lean in. And I don't want to feed either reaction." This wasn't a joke, and it wasn't an invitation. Years later, long after he'd left the music industry, Robbie did something unusual. He anonymously donated a collection of antique children's toys and a worn leather diary to a local historical society near Wiltshire. No note, no return address, but the society placed it all in a glass case, labeled simply "Items from the Blackwood Estate." Circa 1800 S. He never returned to the property. The new owners, an older couple from London, claimed they'd heard strange noises their first few weeks, but eventually things settled. They attributed it to the house's age. But Robbie knew better. He had done what she needed. Not banished her, not destroyed her, but heard her, given her story a voice. He had sung for her, and in doing so, he freed not only Eleanor, but himself. 60.